press and record. So I don't know what week this is of comparative Christianity. I should keep track. I just realized this morning that I haven't posted many videos lately. I need to go back and do that so that folks can catch up if they haven't been following. The great thing though is that this isn't so much a series, so it's not like you didn't like miss anything, you know, if you weren't here last week, since we're kind of doing a survey of everything. But I'm sure folks would want to catch up. Today we're talking North American Episcopalians, which is well, we'll get into the distinction between, you know, British and the Anglican community and Episcopalians in the U.S. So kind of same thing. We're going to talk history, and then we'll kind of look at Episcopalian practices. Again, this is a perfect example where the theology itself is not that different from most mainline Protestantism, but this is a perfect example of where polity and general organization are the main difference, and we'll talk about that. But before we get into that, I just wanted to give you a preview of coming attractions, because I got an opportunity to actually sit down and kind of like do some planning this week. Did I make any promises about what we'd be doing next week? I can't remember.
No.
Okay, good. I want to do the Moravian Church.
Oh, good.
So I started digging into the history there. Absolutely fascinating, and I feel so woefully ignorant concerning a bunch of things after starting to dig into the Moravians. Here's the teaser. So the Moravians trace their origins all the way back to Johannes Hus. Do you remember who that was?
Yep.
He was a reformer that predated Luther.
Yep.
So all the way back to the 15th century. He was Czech, and he had a lot of the same issues that Luther did, but he was called to Rome to stand trial for his attempted reforms, and they handed him over to the secular authorities, and he was burned at the stake. But the Moravian Church traces its origins all the way back to him. I'll spoil the fun of it, but it's essentially an Eastern European church, but they are absolutely fascinating. Primarily, well, no. Okay. Slow down, Jesse. So we'll do the Moravians next week, and that will then officially kind of round out the mainline Protestantism. And then I want to, you know, essentially not jump the shark, but, you know, go to the margins, and I want to kind of circle around. I want to look at like Jehovah's Witness, LDS, Mennonite / Amish traditions, stuff like that. I think that would be fun. This may be, well, I'm still trying to decide whether we're going to do kind of American evangelicalism, primarily because I feel like for me, it would turn into apologetics, which is something that I kind of promised we wouldn't do, but then also I think what we'll end up doing with regards to American evangelicalism is kind of just look at the historical part of it. Because I think it would be really valuable for us to trace where a lot of the holiness movement, the pietism, the kind of decision theology comes from. I have to decide how I'm going to figure that out. Paula, do you have a question?
I don't know if we touched on this or not. I've missed a few sessions. Have you discussed the Anabaptists?
So that will factor into so we're going to do Baptists, but that
Anabaptist.
Yeah, well, despite the strange, despite Anabaptist and Baptist sounding like they're opposite things, there are some corollaries there. Where am I? Okay, real quickly, here's the trouble with approaching something like the Baptist movement or the evangelical movement in America. Is that's like saying we're gonna do mainline Protestantism all in 1 week. Like it's such a broad topic to address, because there's so many different threads in there. Anyways, I'll explain that a little bit more as we go on, but I really want to focus our time on rounding out mainline Protestantism, because my two kind of like motivations in doing this were to understand our proximal neighbors a little bit better, so the traditions that we're in communion with. But then also, you when we started it, many of you were curious about kind of like LDS, Jehovah's Witness, kind of, these folks that we don't encounter so much, kind of get an understanding for what they're about. And as such, I want to address evangelicalism and kind of the Baptist movement, but that almost would require a whole other class to do it justice. And I'm afraid that if I spend too much time on it, it'll just be me ranting, which I don't want to do. So, but then I figured out, because I had so much time, I figured out what our topic after this is going to be. I want to do First Peoples of the Pacific Northwest, specifically First Peoples in Oregon. I recently bought a ton of books, which I spent so much money while Len's been gone. But I bought a ton of books, which I'm just starting to read through, and I'm already enthralled with the topic. And so I think this topic will probably go through June, and then I'm going to take some vacation at the end of June, beginning July. And July itself is going to be kind of funky because we're going to be fitting a couple of Sunday activities in there, including the semi-annual meeting and all that jazz. So I figure we'll pick up with this new topic sometime in August. That would be most likely late August, maybe mid to late August. We'll talk about First Peoples, the PNW, and potentially we'll be able to move into an in-person setting at some point there. So fingers crossed, All right. Sorry. Oh, Marlene, go ahead.
Did we discuss last week or at some time the definition of mainline Christianity? What does mainline mean?
I approached it. So mainline is a distinction of mainline versus old line. Okay. Practically speaking, what it means is it's a distinction between like the main seven. So they're referred to as the seven sisters of American Protestantism, which are the United Methodist Church, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, Presbyterian Church USA, Episcopal Church, United Church of Christ, Disciples of Christ, and then the American Baptist Church. And Reformed Church, Quakers, the the African Methodist Episcopal, and a couple others, I think, are kind of included in the main line. But relatively speaking, it's a distinction between between those who adhere to denominationalism versus non-denominationalism is generally how it's used in the modern sense.
I've had people refer to it as the acceptable ones. The others are radicals.
Well, radical is all depends on your perspective, right?
Yeah.
Radical is a relative statement. Functionally speaking, mainline Protestantism is politically and theologically more progressive relative to its counterpart in the U.S.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So the radical word just slips in there accidentally.
Well, yeah. So, I mean, so many conservative factors within the U.S. Christianity would call mainline Protestantism radical, especially for our ordination of women, our acceptance of LGBTQIA folks, for our racial justice stances. We're the radical church. So radical's not a bad thing, depending on who's using the term.
It just depends on which side you're thinking is radical.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Well, in fact, when we passed the sexuality statement in 2009, the LCMS referred to us as radical Lutherans, which I took to heart. And I thought they were giving us a compliment. Yeah. Okay, so let's talk Episcopalianism. So same question that we always start with: what are your experiences of the American Episcopalian Church? Anybody have roots there?
Yeah, it's been very positive. I recall a couple instances after 9/11. The Episcopal Church here in Portland had a panel discussion, and they had like 6 or 8 rabbis, priests, what have you, discussing 9/11. And it was a really enlightening panel discussion. Lasted 2-3 hours. I've heard Karen Armstrong speak there.
Mm-hmm.
They have a interesting program.
Yeah. I mean, excuse me. Episcopalian Church is, even within mainline Protestantism, relatively progressive with their
Right.
theology and practice. Yeah.
And of course, Marcus Borg's wife is a elder or something there.
Yeah. Glenn wrote, Mary Jo has 20 years in Georgia and Nevada, very much environment oriented. Yeah. But traditional church. Yeah. Yeah. And we'll talk about the Book of Common Prayer too, because that's central to everything Episcopalian.
Is it kind of considered high church?
Yes. Well, yes. Same with all denominations. You have a wide range of worship practice. Although Episcopalian Church, especially, you would be considered relatively high church. There's the distinction within the Episcopalian Church is high church versus broad church, is a term you'll hear used. The low church practicers are mainly those who have fractured off from the Episcopalian Church. So there's like an American Anglican movement or something like that, which that was similar to ELCA. That was a fracture that came out of their talks around around sexuality. And Ordination of Women was the other big split there. Yeah. Anybody raised in the Episcopalian tradition or attended? No. Huh. I'm shocked. No, not really. It's just so far you've all had experiences of them. Yeah. Okay. So Glenn. Yeah. So sorry, Glenn and Mary Jo. I shouldn't leave you out. Yeah. You guys practiced. Was your experience high church? Sorry, I'm asking you to type both. You said both high church and broad church.
Yeah. Isn't the National Cathedral in DC Episcopalian?
Yeah, I think it is.
Yeah, and that's going to be really high church.
Yeah, well, and this is what we'll end up talking about is that if you are in East Coast / the New England area, all of the historical churches are Episcopalian, without really any exception. Yeah, Smells and Bells High Church, Tiffany windows. I love it.
But at least they have ordinated women. I mean, because I know there is a woman that actually was for a long time.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that history, because relative to the ELCA, they were a little bit late adopters for the ordination of women, which is it's a bit unique. Glenn and Mary Jo wrote distinctly modern in some aspects. They're, like I said, their theology and their politics / philosophy are relatively progressive.
I've got a good friend, neighbor, who's Jewish and pretty strong atheist, and he's developed a pretty strong bond with the Episcopal Church here in town. They have been very welcoming and open for discussion, and so it's kind of interesting.
One of the enticing things about the Episcopal Church is that it's a nice blend of Protestantism and Catholicism, where you get the comfort of the hierarchy and the structure, but the politics and the theology are more progressive. There are, I can understand it. Okay, let's do a really brief history. So origins are the Church of England, right? The Episcopal Church in North America was originally the Church of England in the Americas, and no surprise, the point of departure was the American Revolution, and the conflict there is absolutely fascinating. So, and this is a kind of a roughshod description, because the history is much more detailed. But the original Episcopalian churches in the U.S., the first one was in Jamestown, Virginia, 1607, under the Virginia Company of London, and it's the Tower of Jamestown Church. So the cool thing is you can still visit that site, and it's one of the oldest surviving Anglican church structures in the U.S. But the actual Jamestown Church itself is a modern reconstruction. So the other main sites of Episcopalian settlement, well, not settlement, but establishment, were, no surprise, kind of the original colonies: Virginia, New York, Maryland, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Georgia. Here's my one nugget that I had no idea about, but I found absolutely fascinating, is that the Episcopal Church in North America were in full communion with, surprise, surprise, the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Sweden, as far back as the 1700s. And they later absorbed, this is no joke, they later absorbed the Lutheran Church of Sweden into the Episcopal Church just before the American Revolution hit. So it was like 1750s or something like that. They absorbed them, and then by just before the Civil War, they had merged completely. So I have no idea how the history of this plays out, but even in modern day, the Episcopalian Church in North America has full communion with the Church of Sweden. I have no idea what brought that about, except it was, they were in the same area, something like this. But it was the Lutheran bishop Jasper Swedberg who kind of pioneered that road. Okay, so the interesting part of the history of the Episcopal Church is the Revolutionary era. And the crux of the issue here is that when you take your vows as, joining the priesthood, but especially being ordained as a bishop, in the Anglican Church, one of those oaths is to the King of England, to the monarchy of England. So the issue here is, when the Revolutionary War starts, you've got all these Episcopalian priests in the Americas who are literally being forced to choose between their ordination vows and their patriotism. And what you get is this interesting split where something like 80% of the priests in New England and that surrounding area remained loyal to the crown. And it was all the folks in North Carolina and South that went to the Patriots, that went to the revolutionaries. And so for some time, you essentially got kind of a split in the Episcopal Church in North America, where the southern colonies or the southern churches were raring to go. They were ready to break off from the Church of England. But the northern folks still maintained their oaths to the king. And what happened was, with the signing of the Declaration of Independence, one of the clauses in there is actually that it declares anybody who maintains their oaths to the Church of or to the monarchy to be a traitor to the American Revolutionary government. And so you essentially had Episcopal priests who were forced out of their pulpits because they were because they were churches. And to be fair, as far as I could tell, there was no great culling. None of them were executed or anything like that. Most of them just hopped a ship back to Britain. But then what you had this void of clergy in New England and the surrounding areas, where many of the worship services between 1776 and 1790 were lay-led. They would do morning and evening prayer. But because of this huge void and vacancy of parish priests, it became a lay movement for quite some time. So yeah, that was the split. And then finally what happened was there was a series of ordination of bishops after the revolutionary conflict had settled down. Because here's the issue with the Episcopal Church, is one of their core things is the Apostolic Succession. So the Church of England traces its apostolic succession all the way back to Peter via ordination by bishop, which is, by the way, disputed by the Catholic and Orthodox churches. They do not hold the Episcopalian Church's apostolic succession to be true. that's an ongoing issue of conflict there. So the issue is you've now got an independent United States of America. You now have these Episcopal churches, and one of the oaths that you have to swear is to the crown, and you can't do that as an American citizen. So what they actually did was they went to Scotland. So when they tried to establish the Episcopal Church in North America, the first ordained bishop went to the Scottish churches and was ordained as a bishop there, which kind of fulfilled the requirements of the Apostolic Succession, but they didn't have to swear to the crown. Came back, and then the next successive bishop then was approved by the Archbishop of Canterbury, and they kind of like changed the oath so they didn't have to swear to the monarchy anymore. And then from there on out, they kind of sorted it out. But that was by the point in time where, you know, hostilities between the newly independent U.S. and England had settled down, and then kind of from there on out, they were able to reestablish this apostolic line of succession now between the North American Episcopalian Church and you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But if you want to, the Wikipedia page is extremely helpful. If you want to read there, just go into some more detail. It's really fascinating, kind of how that conflict played out and how they made things work. They made do with what they have. But it gave me a newfound respect for kind of like, you know, the struggles of conflict in a denomination. Another major point of change for the Episcopal Church is, of course, the American Civil War, because as you recall, there was kind of this split between the Southern churches and the Northern churches during the Revolutionary War. Well, surprise, surprise, that kind of cultural split maintained up through the Civil War. And what you actually get happening is you get Southern dioceses declaring themselves separate from the from the North American Episcopal Church. And the language around this is absolutely fascinating, because the North American Church basically just said, no, you can't. we ignore your separation. You had, in order for you to lawfully separate, you had to go through the Council of Bishops, and you didn't do that. So sorry, we don't accept it. So coincidentally, when the Civil War ends, like there wasn't a big deal. They're just like, well, you never left anyways. So here we go. But you know, one of the things that did do was kind of solidify the Episcopalian perspective regarding slavery and racial relations. And before the Civil War happened, you actually had an interesting thing where the presiding bishop wrote a piece. On one hand, well, I can't remember the exact language. It was critical of slavery, but still, you know, for that time, you know, relatively moderate. But that document then was immediately responded to by the Southern churches, or somebody from a bishop from the Southern, I think from the Diocese of Mississippi or Alabama, one of those two, that was like, slavery is fine, blah, blah, blah. But that kind of got reconciled, and that bishop, the bishop from Alabama, obviously was forced out following the end of the Civil War. That's the 19th century. Anything else I want to talk about? Oh, I should mention the Episcopalians in the South temporarily formed the Protestant Episcopal Church in the Confederate States of America, and it was short-lived. But here's an interesting piece out of that, is there was actually a splinter off that resulted. I mean, no surprise, when everything ended and everybody kind of came back together, there was a small faction that broke off and formed the Reformed Episcopal Church, but I don't think that one lasted very long either. I think they disappeared relatively quickly. And then the other big era of change for the Episcopal Church was post-World War II up through the 1970s, and it was mainly around the Civil Rights Movement. It was the Bishop of Mississippi during the Civil War, but then the Episcopalian Church made a relatively profound statement for racial equality as early as 1960 or 1959. And from then onwards, the Episcopal Church was very pro civil rights, except for the Bishop of Alabama. And he didn't last very long either. Yeah, he was forced out. Anything more I want to mention here? Oh, no, it's always Alabama and Mississippi, because then the Bishop of Mississippi got uppity in 1973, but that was mainly around women. Okay, so here we go. Here's the history regarding women in the Episcopal Church. Do y'all recall when we ordained the first woman in the Lutheran tradition?
Not really.
It was pretty darn close to 50 years ago, but I don't know how to do the math.
1970. So the correlation here is that the Episcopal Church allowed for the first time women as delegates to the General Convention in 1970. So up to 1970, women were not allowed to be basically delegates or in leadership in the Episcopal Church. And from there on out, it was actually kind of a fast movement. What did I want to, but anyways, it wasn't until 1976, that's 1974 that women were ordained in the Episcopal Church. And interestingly enough, it didn't start as a change in polity. It started by rebels. Some radical Episcopalian dioceses started ordaining women. So there were two kind of movements. There were the Philadelphia 11. So the bishops there ordained 11 women in 1974, followed by the Washington 4 in 1976. And then in 1977 was when the General Assembly decided to officially recognize the ordination of women in the Episcopal Church. First women bishop was 1989. So voila. What else? Okay, and then the other big thing. Do y'all recall who the first LGBTQ bishop in the United States was of any denomination? It was a big deal back in the day, where this dude had to wear a bulletproof vest because he was under so much threat. What did Glenn and Mary Jo? Really? Hold on one sec. Glenn said the first woman bishop is from Corvallis, trained as a biologist. No kidding. Let me hold on. Where did that one go? 1989. I'll have to do some research on that. That's great. Thanks for that. So do y'all recall who the first bishop was? Gene Robinson. Does that name ring a bell? Yeah. So he was ordained as the first bishop in the Episcopalian Church in 2006, I think.
Yeah.
2003. Yeah. This is relatively ancient history. But here's the thing. I mean, you got to respect the Episcopalians for this, is that as far back as 1976 at the General Assembly, the General Convention affirmed that homosexuals are children of God and that they deserve acceptance and pastoral care and equal protection under the law. The first gay person ordained as a priest was in 1977. So here's the mind-blowing thing, is that you had women and the first gay person literally being ordained in the same year, right? So when it rains, it storms, I guess, for them. But then during that period, so from 1977 to 1991, gay people were accepted within the church, but there was still this, there was no marriage equality up to that point. Oh, no, sorry, I'm getting my timeline wrong. It was 1991 that they reinforced that gay people are accepted, but marriage is still a monogamous union between husband and wife. But then after Bishop Robinson's ordination, then that kind of swayed. So here's the coincidental thing. So 2009, the same year that we made our sexuality statement, was when the General Convention said same-sex blessings are in. And then in 2012, it also gave bishops and priests the option to bless same-sex unions. And then in 2015, they removed that definition of marriage. So within the Episcopalian Church in North America now, there is no, each church decides. Same-sex marriages are across the board legal within, or legal, allowed, performed within the Episcopal Church in North America. And then the other, thing of significance, are you aware who the current presiding bishop is within the Episcopal Church? He preached at a very significant function not so long ago at the marriage of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. His name is Michael Curry. He's the first African-American bishop in the Episcopal Church, or first presiding bishop. There were African-American bishops before, and he was formerly in the Diocese of North Carolina. He's a fascinating dude. I love listening to him talk. He's a great preacher. Okay, that is the relative history. Real quick, let's talk polity. Oh, here, let me show you a map real quick. This is the map of the ecclesial provinces within North America. And there are, I think, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 major ecclesial provinces within the US. So you can kind of tell some things it's geographical, but it's also population based. So you notice how there are, New England, New York area, the Virginia area, they're pretty, relatively small geographic wise, but that's where you get your major sources of Episcopalianism. But look how big the West Coast one is. This should be an indicator that there are less Episcopalians on the West Coast. The West Coast one includes Alaska, Hawaii, and Taiwan is included in that as well too. And that's something I need to talk about too, is the distinction between dioceses. Remind me, I'll get to that. But then there's this little circle down here, and I'm really curious to find out what this is about. At the corner of Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, and Utah.
It's the Navajo people.
Is that what it is?
Yeah, they live their reservation.
Oh, that's great, man.
Mostly within Arizona, but there are also a lot of Navajo people that live in New Mexico, northwest New Mexico, and southeast Utah.
I'm so glad you were here to enlighten us on that. That is great.
I mean, I caught that too. I thought they must have a special,
It's the diocese. It must be the Navajo diocese then.
Yeah.
Because that's what all these lines represent, is they represent the individual diocese,
Mm-hmm.
So Oregon has 2 dioceses, which is also fascinating because the politics between the 2 dioceses is really apparently conflicted because it's essentially the Willamette Valley and then everything east of the Cascades. You can see how Oregon is divided there. All right. I just wanted to show that so we can get a relative understanding of what we're talking about. Okay, this is not going to take long. So theology of the Episcopalian Church, surprise, surprise, very little different between the Episcopalian Church and, for example, the ELCA. Their stance on communion is relatively the same. They are true presence folks, same as us. So the idea that Christ, it's truly the body and blood of Christ, but we don't come up with any magical explanation on that. It just is. A significant or an interesting difference there is the way they talk about sacraments is in the Episcopal Church, they say there are 2 main sacraments, which are baptism and communion, but they acknowledge the 5 other sacraments. So the Catholic Church has 7 sacraments. The Episcopalians acknowledge the sacraments of unction. Hold on. I forgot already. Unction, marriage,
Confirmation, ordination, marriage, confession, and unction.
Thank you, Paula. Okay, so we talked sacraments. relatively the same approach to scripture. I mean, one of the interesting differences here is that like the Episcopal Church has approved translations of scripture. Unlike, you know, in ELCA, you'll get recommended translations of scripture. They have a listing of translations that are officially approved. And this has to do with the kind of the hierarchy and the general polity of it. We talked about communion. I'm probably missing something there. Creeds, they hold Apostles and Nicene. I don't know what their stance is in the Athanasian, but if you look at the Episcopalian website, they don't mention the Athanasian Creed. So that might be an interesting question to approach. But the the interesting thing, we already talked about this, but we'll come back around to it, is the Book of Prayer. The Book of Prayer is their guiding document for worship. Straight up, there's nothing else. So the way that it works then is that, yeah, was that at an Episcopal church, Glenn, or was that at Milwaukee, the Athanasian Creed? I've only done it a few times, and it's okay. You did all okay, so they do the Athanasian Creed. Okay, that's helpful. So the Book of Common Prayer is their single governing worship document. And so if they want to make changes to worship, they have to make changes to the Book of Prayer, which you can probably imagine takes some concerted effort. It has to be done at the General Assembly. And I'm assuming they have a publishing house that does this. But here's the interesting thing. You can download the entire Common Book of Prayer from the Episcopal website. You can get a PDF of it. It's 1,001 pages long. I downloaded it just for kicks, not realizing it was going to be that large of a document. But that's an interesting thing. Whereas the ELW is copyright protected. Like if I want to get scans of the ELW, I literally have to scan the book myself. They don't exist online, which is one of my great beefs, especially considering this past year of virtual worship. Like getting scans of music is pulling teeth, because trying to scan that book is a pain in the patoot, you know, because it's thick. Why can't we have that? I mean, I'd pay 50 cents a pop if they made the entire thing digitized. This studying other mainline denominations has just brought up more beefs with the ELCA for me. I hope
Copyrighting hymns prior to a copyright holding, like, it upsets me to no end.
I don't even get me started. I hope Bishop Eaton isn't watching this, but anyways, that's something. The Common Book of Prayer, I mean, a cool thing about it is that, you know, its origins date all the way back to the formation of the Church of England. Obviously, the Common Book of Prayer has diverged between the Anglican Church in England and the Episcopal Church. I mean, the practices are different, especially considering the differences in polity, where the Anglican Church in England, as far as I'm aware, does not have the same.
It's June.
Hello.
You guys are.
No, it's okay. Feel free to join in. I don't think they have as progressive polity and theology as the North American expression does, but I didn't get a chance to dive into that too much. Okay, enough of me talking. All the stuff that we've gone over. Any questions, Jill?
There's some relationship between the Methodist Church and the Episcopal Church that I don't quite know. And I'm wondering, do you think that that's related to that moment in time where they went over to Scotland to have a little bit of a thing?
I don't think so. Are you talking about the AME, the African American Methodist Episcopal, or African Methodist Episcopal Church?
Well, that's true, and I get that. I don't exactly know what I'm talking about.
Oh.
I've just heard like little rumblings here and there about like the Methodists are like kind of ticked off about the situation of the United's concerns. So they're like, well, we'll just go back to Episcopal. I don't know what this means. That's
well,
why
I
I'm
mean,
asking.
we can trace the origins and the history there, because, you know, so the roots of the Methodist Church are essentially Church of Scotland. Well, that's Presbyterian more, but all three of them are coming out of, you know, Britain's Christianity, right? So the Methodist Church, if you recall, was what were the names of those dudes? George Fox and others that I can't remember off the top of my head, who, you know, established this idea of the method, right? They were all about practice, but they fled the Church of England because of persecution, you know, and established in, if you recall, Pennsylvania and the New England area. So what you've got essentially is you've got this interesting movement of Church of England churches being established in the New England, Virginia area, and you've got Lutheran, Methodist, Presbyterian that are kind of going in the outlying colonies. So Pennsylvania, you know, that. So I don't know specifically what you're thinking of, but I mean, just tracing the lineages of the two churches, Methodism is an intentional diversion or intentional break off of the Church of England, and that I'm sure that carries through into the modern era to some extent. But then, so like the other curious thing is that something I didn't really mention about in the history is that the Episcopal Church had black churches dating back pre-Civil War. Like there was actually a black tradition within the Episcopal Church because there was a very intentional it was one of the main mission fields of the Episcopal Church was to outreach into the slave community and black community. And so post Civil War, you know, the Episcopal Church kind of had the market on black churches, black movements. The AME, as far as I understand it, which is the African Methodist Episcopal Church, I think was a merger between a couple of communities. But I didn't do any research on that. I'll check into it and I'll have some answers for you next week.
Well, if I come up with why I think this, I might send you an email or something, because it was just like somebody talking and I was like, what is that about? So I thought I'd ask.
Okay.
Yeah, well, we'll stay in contact.
Well, the method, just glancing at it, the AME was a break off of the Methodist Church.
Well, yeah, I read something this morning in that the Methodists were being super racist because they were making the black people not kneel in church, and the Episcopals said, we'll take you. And so
that doesn't surprise me, like considering that, like I said, the amount of outreach that the Episcopalians did into the black community. Yeah. So here's the thing. There, again, theologically, there is very little difference between, for example, the ELCA and the Episcopal Church. And so almost the totality of the major difference is in polity. So if were any of you tuned in to the whole full communion agreement between the ELCA and the Episcopal Church dating back to the early 1990s? Does that ring any bells for you?
Yeah. Yes.
So do you recall it being conflicting, or what was your memory of it?
What I got out of it was that when we merged, the bishop had a bigger role in that he had to be agreed to lay people providing communion, whereas before the pastor could do it.
That's interesting.
That became an issue because the church group went to the coast for a weekend.
Yeah.
And before the pastor could bless the stuff, and that'd be great. After, he couldn't do that anymore. And we couldn't have communion on the coast.
The major piece that I always heard about was the ordination, the Apostolic Succession piece, because in order for there to be full communion between the two of us, which again, full communion means the ability to preach and preside over communion in each other's congregations. we had to agree to the Apostolic Succession, also known as the historic episcopate. And that was one of the big sources of conflict. And I've spoken about that, especially with my experience in seminary. But so, when we did our full communion agreement, this at the end of the day is the major structural difference, is that Apostolic Succession piece, which is kind of miraculous if you think about it, that the ELCA and the Episcopal Church have any full communion, considering how congregationally oriented the ELCA is relative to other denominations that we've talked about. Because like we've talked about the Presbyterians, the Methodists, they both have more hierarchical structures than we do. I mean, it's different hierarchy, but that was the main thing. So here's my question that we can talk about for a little bit is, and we may have kind of discussed a similar question. It was either last week or two weeks ago, but it bears repeating, is, do you think hierarchy is good for the church? Or do you think we should be flat as a board, everybody sharing everything in common? No wrong answers here. Jill, go.
When hierarchy provides a set of knowability of what is taking place, this does not concern me. When that hierarchy converts to some sort of, you can only get through the doors of the front of the church if you accede, then that does confront.
So you like maybe the structure and consistency that it provides, but not gatekeeping, not when it turns to gatekeeping.
I think that's right. I think that's well rephrased. Yeah.
Okay.
I think that, having grown up as a Catholic, which is a hierarchical based church, I think their hierarchy gets in the way of a lot of progress that they could be making. Because I mean, personally, I find that the Catholic Church quite appealing in some ways, but in other ways, if you just look at their inability to ordain women and a lot of the social things that they have not adapted to. And the funny thing about them is eventually they will.
Yeah.
If we could put ourselves forward 200 years, you'll see that the Catholic Church that we, as future travelers, would be the church that a lot of people would like to have today.
Yeah.
And they've been really slowly adapting to changes in Western society and world society as time goes by. But the hierarchy itself is what keeps them frozen in the past. So if you think about it that way, it's really not only damaging to the institution, but it's damaging to its adherents, because there are a lot of people that find themselves at odds with the teachings of the church, even though they're still nominally members. And so, it sets up this odd dynamic of, how many Catholic women do you think don't practice birth control?
Yeah.
Today?
Yeah.
So I don't know. I think hierarchy can make it a difficult situation for both the institution and the members of it.
Yeah, that's a good perspective too. Yeah. And
I guess,
Go
from my
Andy.
perspective, the intellectual rigor that a hierarchical system could help establish is a benefit, because it helps, if you want to come up with your own ideas, that's great, but you're going to be criticized, or you're going to find acceptance based upon that, rather than just another diocese forming up because they have this little idea that they're going to go do their own thing and they don't care about anything else. So, I think it's better to have a little bit of structure. And to me, that structure would be, as I said, I think the rigor of an intellectual process.
Yeah.
I mean, the rest of it, I'm not really, I'm not one that really likes all of the dogma, because I think you lose rigor with dogma. You just, you lose the idea. It's gone. It's set in stone, and you don't really know, you don't understand what's going on and why.
Yeah. It's just something that It's something you know you're supposed to believe, but you don't really understand why. And there's no debate, no discourse.
Right.
Yeah.
Jesse,
Yeah.
I found that the Sisters of the Holy Names, founders of Marylhurst,
Yeah.
they believe strongly in the order of things from the Pope, but they did their own thing. They
Yeah.
didn't feel bound by things. They were contemporary women, and they set their own standards, and it was very impressive.
Yeah. I mean,
Mhm.
it's, and I've always found that kind of like philosophy really fascinating. This idea of like, we acknowledge the authority, we place our, maybe our
Mhm.
trust, or at least our trust in that authority, but we also, choose to disobey, especially if we think they're wrong.
Yeah, one of the sisters said some people there would question them just for orneriness. And one of the professors said to her something about, well, the Pope says such and such. And she responded with, "You don't think I believe everything the Pope says, do you?" So that summed up the Sisters of the Holy Names philosophy perfectly well. So
I would love to hear at some point somebody who considers themselves a relatively Orthodox Catholic describe to me how they understand the Pope's role in the grand scheme of things.
mhm.
Because for somebody who's supposed to be the voice of God, I'm really confused by this idea that you don't necessarily have to believe everything that comes out of their mouth.
Yeah.
Well, what you'd run into, Jesse, it not just ask one person. If you ask 10 people
Yeah,
and say a focus group, you'd get 10 different answers.
I'm sure. Yeah, I'm sure.
know?
Yeah. Well, I love all of this, and thank you for your responses, because like, here's the thing too, Matt, you were talking about how in the case of the Catholic Church, the hierarchy holds them back, where it's kind of about clinging to the status quo, reinforcing the doctrine and the religion. But then you compare it to something like the Episcopal Church in North America, which it seems like the hierarchy is on the bleeding edge of progression, right? Where it's almost like they're pulling the rest of the church along with them. And it's almost an opposite example, although when you look at something like women's ordination, like for me, it's such an oxymoronic thing, right? This idea that here's this church that was doing, in relative to 2021, extremely progressive work in racial justice, was doing extremely progressive work for that time and age in LGBTQ matters, but didn't ordain women until 1977. Like that was their hang up. And if you go and look at like some of their, the equivalent of their social statements, like for example, on abortion, they speak that the church itself is opposed to abortion, except in extreme circumstances. But, they've got the caveat in there, but they refuse to condemn anyone because of their, they acknowledge that this is not necessarily something that the church should have authority over, especially with regards to the secular world. So, the way in which that hierarchy navigates the world is itself, interesting. Jill.
This is kind of like what we were talking about last week with Disciples of Christ, because they're like, we're the most expansive view in the world, except the one thing we're going to be all in on is the intellectual assent to being Christian, the Armenian view, so to speak. And it's like,
Yeah.
Really? You're completely wide open on like all the things, but that was the one you chose? Like, is weird, right? Like there's
Yeah.
always like a thing, and why was that one? And it's funny.
Well, this reminds me of something that one of my professors said to me in seminaries. They said, be very, very careful about the hills you choose to die on. The way that he described it was, you've essentially got your hill and everything else is adiaphora, the Greek word for, miscellaneous. It's like you pick your things, but you got to be willing to roll with everything else, right? Otherwise you're going to get torn apart. And I think at the end of the day, that kind of is an interesting metaphor for how this all works. Is one of the benefits of hierarchy is that it can both establish consistency, but it can also maintain an opportunity for openness. Like for example, because one of the dangers in a very congregational denomination, for example, is that you run the risk of having cults of personality. You run the risk of, individual churches becoming very exclusive, to the detriment of the whole. But you have the same but you run the same risk, in a very hierarchical church where the whole hierarchy can maintain a very, rigid status quo. Which just brings me back, there is no perfect form of governance, church or secular, right? It really comes down to how we individual units function within the rules that we establish, which this has been one of the beautiful things for me in this whole conversation, is the ability to look at all of these different denominations, how they function bureaucratically, and see that, we share so much in common, and it really just comes down to how everybody operates within the system they're provided at the end of the day. There is no perfect world. Here, Glenn put another thing in the chat. He says, hard to believe that their suburban Episcopal parish in Atlanta had no people of color in 1993, but today is 75% Black. That's, what a crazy thing. Same service, same Book of Common Prayer, but how geographic population, things affect churches. And one of the, to the benefit of the Episcopal Church, I think because of their tradition in being connected to the Black community, probably made them more open and more flexible. Whereas this is one of the ongoing stains on Lutheranism, as far as I'm concerned, is because we are so white, and because we historically have not been super at the front edge of the civil rights movement, we continue to be white, and we've changed significantly. I mean, obviously by our politics and our conversation, but there is a benefit to having been doing that work since the 19th century. It changes the DNA of an institution. Whereas we're so much Eurocentric, it's hard to change that DNA. I'm curious too. Well, that's going to launch into a whole other. What I was going to say, I'm curious how that high church, stuff functions in a very social, cultural, pluralistic, setting. I don't know.
Yeah, to me, the looking into the various religious dioceses, sects, and all of that, it's a rather humbling experience, because you look at it and you kind of write, well, these are thoughtful people, hopefully, that have made these choices, but they're sometimes they're diametrically opposed.
Yeah.
Therefore, it's like, well, it just shows that man is by nature imperfect, and you're just seeing it right there in spades.
Absolutely.
And therefore, the whole idea of a religious order, organization, church saying they are it is ludicrous.
Yeah. Yeah, it kind of goes back to it. Really, it's up to everybody to operate within what they have. It's a. I just wanted to share one final statistic with you. When do you think was the last time the Book of Common Prayer was revised? Any guesses?
1896.
Not quite that bad. Yeah.
1941.
No, not quite that bad either. Yeah. 1979 was the last time the Book of Common Prayer was revised, which simultaneously speaks to the rigidity of a hierarchy, but also the nature of that hierarchy, in that their governing worship document still maintains its relevance in 40 plus years later. Whereas we need to change our worship book every 5 years to keep up with the socio-political trends, to the point where we've got, I don't know how many, 4 different worship books that we use. And, I can't, when's the next revision of the ELW gonna, how many people are going to riot and revolt because we changed from the red book to the blue book or the purple book or something? I don't know. Congregationalism, man. It's such a hoot. All right. Well, thanks for a great conversation today, folks. It was super fun as always. So next week, I've also kind of made an executive decision while we're talking. We'll look at the Moravian Church, and if we have some time left over, I want to look at the American Baptist churches as kind of an intro into that topic, because I realized that's one blank spot we have on our main line. Out of the 7 sisters of mainline Protestantism, we haven't covered the American Baptist churches. So if we have time, we'll get into that. Otherwise, we'll come back around to it at some point, because I don't want to leave that out. All right.